On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Japanese aircraft appeared over Pearl Harbor. Within minutes, battleships were burning, aircraft were destroyed on the ground, and the United States had suffered one of the most consequential surprise attacks in modern history. The date is familiar, the images are familiar, and the explanation is familiar. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America entered the war. The Second World War became truly global. It is a story so deeply embedded in popular memory that Pearl Harbor can seem like the moment World War II suddenly arrived in the Pacific. But there is a problem with that picture. The shooting began on December 7th. The economic conflict had begun years earlier. Long before Japanese aircraft crossed the Hawaiian sky, American and Japanese governments were already fighting over access to markets, raw materials, strategic territory, shipping, finance, and the future economic order of Asia. There were no bombers over Hawaii yet. There were export licenses, there were tariffs, there were frozen bank accounts, there were restrictions on steel and scrap metal, there were negotiations over oil, there were competing visions of who should control China and Southeast Asia, and eventually there was a resource problem that could not be negotiated away. Japan was an industrial power with an enormous strategic weakness. It needed foreign resources to sustain the very military expansion that was supposed to make it independent of foreign powers. And the country supplying many of those resources was the United States. That contradiction would become the center of the crisis, because Washington increasingly believed that economic pressure could restrain Japanese expansion without requiring an American declaration of war. Tokyo increasingly believed that accepting that pressure would mean abandoning the position Japan had spent a decade building in Asia. Each side could therefore convince itself that it was acting defensively, and that is what makes this story more disturbing. The road to Pearl Harbor was not simply a road from peace to war, it was a road from economic interdependence to economic coercion, from coercion to strategic desperation, and from desperation to a military gamble. To understand how that happened, we have to go back, not to December 1941, and not even to September 1939, but to the collapse of the international economic and political order after the First World War. The world of the 1920s had been built around an increasingly fragile assumption. Countries would trade, capital would move across borders, currencies would remain convertible, empires would provide markets and resources, international institutions would discourage territorial conquest, and economic interdependence would make another great war too expensive to contemplate. For a while, this system appeared to work. Then the Great Depression arrived. Between 1929 and the mid-1930s, international trade contracted dramatically. The United States itself moved toward greater protectionism. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930 raised American tariffs substantially, and other governments retaliated or adopted their own barriers. It would be wrong to say that Smoot-Hawley caused the Great Depression by itself. Economic historians have debated its quantitative importance, and the Depression had much deeper monetary, financial, and structural causes. But something important did happen. The international economy became more fragmented. Countries increasingly tried to protect domestic production, preserve foreign exchange, secure strategic supplies, and reduce dependence on markets they could no longer trust. The global economy began to divide into competing economic spaces, and Japan was watching. Japan had industrialized rapidly during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but it remained unusually dependent on foreign trade and imported raw materials. It had factories, it had shipyards, it had steel production, it had a sophisticated navy, it had an increasingly modern industrial economy, but it did not possess abundant domestic supplies of many of the resources required to sustain that economy. Oil was the most dramatic example. Japan could manufacture warships, but it could not manufacture the petroleum required to operate them on the scale necessary for a modern war. This created a strategic dilemma. If Japan remained dependent on international markets, foreign powers could potentially strangle its economy. If Japan conquered resource-rich territories, it could become more economically self-sufficient. But territorial expansion would provoke precisely the foreign powers Japan feared. The solution to one vulnerability created another, and the first major break came in Manchuria. In September 1931, an explosion near the Japanese-controlled South Manchurian Railway was used as a pretext for Japanese military action. The Japanese army rapidly expanded its control over Manchuria and established the state of Manchukuo. The United States refused to recognize the territorial changes produced by force. Secretary of State Henry Stimson announced what became known as the Stimson Doctrine. Washington would not recognize arrangements that violated existing treaty obligations or the principle of the open door in China. The League of Nations investigated. The Lytton Commission eventually concluded that the Japanese occupation could not be accepted as a legitimate settlement. Japan rejected the international criticism and withdrew from the League. The crucial point is not simply that Japan occupied Manchuria. It is what the episode demonstrated. The international system had rules, but enforcing those rules required states to accept costs. And in the middle of a worldwide economic depression, the major powers were reluctant to pay those costs. The United States was not prepared to fight Japan over Manchuria. Britain had strategic interests throughout Asia and had to consider the vulnerability of Hong Kong, Singapore, India, and its other imperial possessions. European governments were consumed by economic crisis and increasingly worried about events closer to home. So the system responded with investigation, diplomacy, non-recognition, and warnings. Japan discovered that expansion could produce enormous diplomatic opposition without immediately producing military resistance. That lesson mattered, but Japan's economic problems did not disappear. The depression had hit rural communities especially hard. The Japanese military increasingly argued that dependence on foreign trade made the country vulnerable. The answer, in their view, was not simply to trade more efficiently. It was to build an economic sphere Japan could control. Manchuria offered coal, iron, land, railways, and strategic depth. China offered a vast potential market and enormous resources. The problem was that China was not empty economic space waiting for someone to organize it. Chinese nationalism was growing. The Chinese government resisted Japanese domination. Foreign powers had their own commercial interests, and the United States continued to support the principle that China's territorial integrity and commercial access should not simply be rewritten by military conquest. This was not yet Pearl Harbor. It was something more fundamental. It was a collision between two economic visions. The American vision emphasized an international commercial order in which no single power could close China to competitors. The Japanese imperial vision increasingly emphasized regional economic control, strategic security, and the creation of a self-sufficient bloc. Neither side saw its own position as simply economic. For Washington, the issue was connected to international law, security, and the balance of power. For Tokyo, economic access was inseparable from national survival and imperial security. And then in 1937, the conflict in China exploded into full-scale war. The Second Sino-Japanese War transformed the problem. Japan was no longer simply occupying a strategic territory. It was fighting a huge continental war. Wars consume resources. Aircraft require aluminum and fuel. Tanks require steel. Ships require steel and oil. Trucks require rubber and petroleum. Factories require machinery. Armies require food, clothing, chemicals, transportation, and credit. The longer the war continued, the more resources Japan needed, and the war did not end quickly. That mattered because Japanese planners had to confront an uncomfortable reality. Expansion was supposed to make Japan economically stronger. Instead, prolonged war was making Japan increasingly dependent on imported materials. The contradiction was becoming harder to hide. The United States was now watching Japan's expansion with growing alarm. American policymakers had several tools available. They could protest diplomatically. They could support. That meant the American-Japanese economic relationship contained a hidden switch. As long as the switch remained on, Japan could fuel an enormous military machine. If it were turned off, Japan faced a strategic crisis. Washington knew this. Tokyo knew this. And neither side could be certain how the other would react if the switch was actually pulled. The first major escalation came in 1940. The United States began tightening export controls on strategic materials. Iron and steel scrap became especially important. In September 1940, the Roosevelt administration announced that licenses for exports of iron and steel scrap would effectively be limited to the Western Hemisphere and Britain. The decision had a clear American justification. The United States was rapidly expanding its own defense production. Strategic materials were needed at home. But the policy also had an obvious effect on Japan. A major source of industrial material was being closed. Japanese officials protested. They argued that the restrictions were discriminatory and politically motivated. From Washington's perspective, the measures could be defended as national defense controls. From Tokyo's perspective, the pattern was becoming unmistakable. Access to resources was being transformed into a political weapon. Then came another turning point. In September 1940, Japan joined Germany and Italy in the Tripartite Pact. The pact was partly intended to deter the United States from intervening against the Axis powers. Instead, it deepened American fears that Japanese expansion was becoming part of a broader Axis strategy. Japan now appeared to Washington not merely as a regional power fighting China, but as a potential member of a global coalition challenging the existing international order. Again, the economic and geopolitical systems reinforced one another. Japan sought resources partly because it feared strategic dependence. America restricted resources partly because it feared Japanese expansion. And Washington saw that project as a direct threat to the balance of power in the Pacific. Then in July 1941, Japan moved into southern French Indochina. This was the moment when the economic confrontation became extremely dangerous. The United States responded by freezing Japanese assets in the United States. This is sometimes described simply as the oil embargo, but the mechanism was more complicated. The asset freeze brought Japanese financial transactions under American control. That meant Japanese firms could no longer freely use their American-held funds to purchase American goods, and oil was the critical commodity. On August 1st, the United States revoked existing petroleum export licenses to countries outside a designated group that included the Western Hemisphere, the British Empire, the Netherlands Indies, and other territories resisting aggression. The practical effect was devastating for Japan. The problem was not merely that Japan had lost access to one American supplier. The international market itself was shrinking. Britain controlled major sea routes. The Dutch East Indies were still under Dutch control. The United States possessed enormous oil production. Japan could not simply replace American supplies by making a purchase somewhere else. And this is where the economic war became a strategic trap. Japan had spent years trying to escape dependence on foreign resources. Now the attempt to escape dependence had helped produce the war that made those resources even more necessary. The Japanese military therefore faced a brutal calculation. If it backed down, it risked abandoning its position in China and accepting the conditions imposed by foreign powers. If it continued negotiating indefinitely, its fuel reserves would decline. If it moved south, it could seize the Dutch East Indies and obtain the oil it desperately needed. But moving south meant confronting the British, Dutch, and potentially the Americans. And that meant war. The oil embargo did not mechanically cause Pearl Harbor. That distinction matters. Japan's aggression in China came first. Japanese expansion into Indochina came first. The Tripartite Pact came first. The United States did not impose sanctions on an innocent Japan that had simply been sitting peacefully at home. Economic pressure was a response to Japanese expansion. At the same time, the sanctions changed the strategic calculation. They made time itself an enemy of Japan. Every month without a settlement meant consuming stocks of fuel while remaining cut off from reliable supplies. The question was no longer simply, can Japan defeat America? The Japanese leadership was asking something more immediate. How long can Japan wait? And that question brings us to one of the most important people in the story. Hideki Tojo. Tojo did not create Japanese expansionism by himself. He inherited a political system. Diplomats sought an agreement. Civilian leaders feared the consequences of war. The emperor had an important constitutional and symbolic position. The Navy understood the enormous industrial advantage of the United States. The Army remained committed to the war in China and to the broader strategic program. The Japanese leadership was not a single mind. It was a coalition of institutions with different priorities. That mattered enormously, because when a country faces an existential strategic problem, Internal disagreement can make compromise more difficult. A leader may know that war is dangerous and still conclude that retreat is politically impossible. A diplomat may know that negotiations are failing and still continue them because the alternative is war. A military planner may know that the enemy is stronger and still believe that delaying the decision makes the situation worse. That is exactly the environment in which calculated risk becomes desperation. And there was another human hinge on the American side. Cordell Hull, Roosevelt's Secretary of State, believed deeply in principles of international law and commercial equality. The United States was increasingly insisting on several principles in its negotiations with Japan: respect for territorial integrity, non-interference in other countries, equality of commercial opportunity, and peaceful settlement of disputes. These principles were not simply economic demands, they were the foundation of the international order Washington wanted to defend. But they collided directly with Japan's position in China. Japan wanted recognition of its strategic and economic position. The United States wanted Japan to accept a regional order in which conquest could not simply become ownership. The disagreement was therefore much larger than the price of oil. Oil was the immediate pressure point. China was the deeper political dispute, and the future of Asia was the underlying question. By November 1941, the two governments were running out of room. It was attacking because America was strong enough to threaten the Japanese Southern strategy. The Japanese leadership knew it was taking an enormous gamble. The hope was not to conquer the continental United States. It was to inflict enough damage on American naval power to create time for Japan to seize and fortify the resource zone, then force a negotiated settlement. That calculation would prove disastrously wrong, but it was not irrational in the narrow sense. It was based on assumptions about American public opinion, political willingness to fight, Japanese military capability, and the possibility of a negotiated settlement after an initial shock. The Japanese leadership underestimated the political effect of the attack itself. Pearl Harbor did not frighten America into compromise. It unified America for war. And that brings us back to the beginning. December 7th, 1941. The attack was tactically successful. The Japanese struck before the United States could fully mobilize its enormous industrial capacity. But the attack did not solve Japan's economic problem. It made the problem larger. Japan still needed oil. It still needed raw materials. It still needed shipping. It still needed access to conquered territories. And now it was at war with the industrial power that had supplied much of what Japan needed. The economic war had become a shooting war, and the shooting war would eventually expose the limits of Japan's entire strategic model. The human cost of the earlier economic confrontation was already being felt long before the bombs fell on Hawaii. Chinese civilians had endured years of war, occupation, displacement, bombing, famine, and atrocities. Japanese civilians had experienced shortages and increasing economic controls as the state mobilized for total war. Workers were drawn into military production, families faced rationing, farmers and industrial workers became part of an economy increasingly organized around strategic necessity. Across Europe and Asia, the collapse of normal trade meant shortages were no longer temporary inconveniences. They could determine whether factories operated, whether armies moved, whether civilians ate, whether governments survived. This is why economic history is not merely about prices and trade statistics. A trade restriction can look abstract on a government document. Export license denied, assets frozen, strategic material restricted. But behind those phrases is a physical reality, a machine that cannot be built, a ship that cannot sail, a truck that cannot move, a factory that cannot operate, a military that has to ration fuel, and eventually a government deciding whether the only remaining way to obtain a resource is to seize it. That is the deeper mechanism behind the Pearl Harbor story. The famous event was not an isolated military decision. It was the visible end of a long chain. The United States could have chosen different forms or levels of economic pressure. Negotiators could have reached a temporary arrangement. Japanese leaders could have rejected the military option. American leaders could have altered their negotiating position. Different choices might have produced different outcomes, but each alternative had costs. And that is what makes the historical lesson more useful than a simple morality tale. The problem was not that one side possessed all the information and deliberately chose disaster. The problem was that every major actor faced incentives that made compromise difficult. Japan feared strategic dependence. America feared unchecked expansion. Britain feared the collapse of its Asian position. China needed continued resistance. The Dutch wanted to preserve their colonial possessions. Germany wanted Japan to pressure the Western powers. Japanese military leaders feared losing the fruits of expansion. American policymakers feared that concessions would reward aggression. Each fear reinforced another, and eventually the system became trapped. There is an important scholarly disagreement here. Some historians have placed particular emphasis on Japanese militarism, imperial ideology, and the war in China. Others have emphasized American economic pressure and the tightening financial and oil embargo. Still others have focused on the interaction between the two, arguing that neither Japanese expansion nor American sanctions can adequately explain the final crisis by itself. There is also disagreement over how much responsibility should be assigned to Roosevelt personally for the final economic pressure. The documentary record does not justify the simplistic claim that Roosevelt secretly engineered Pearl Harbor as a deliberate trap, nor does it justify pretending that American policy was passive. The Roosevelt administration progressively used economic power to constrain Japan while preparing the United States for the possibility of war. There were also bureaucratic disputes over how strictly the asset freeze and export controls should be implemented. Some scholars, including those who have studied the financial side of the embargo, have argued that the practical effect of the freeze became more severe than some senior officials initially envisioned. Others place greater responsibility on the broader administration and on Roosevelt's strategic choices. The evidence does not eliminate the disagreement, and it does not need to. The strongest conclusion is simpler. Economic pressure mattered. Japanese expansion mattered more fundamentally, and the interaction between them mattered most. That interaction transformed a regional conflict into a global one. It also helps explain why the Pacific War cannot be understood simply as a surprise attack. Pearl Harbor was a surprise tactically. It was not a surprise strategically. American leaders knew Japan was preparing for possible war. Japanese leaders knew the United States was preparing for possible war. What neither side fully understood was how quickly the remaining space for compromise was disappearing. That is the institutional failure at the heart of the story. The international system had been designed for a world in which trade could help stabilize political relations. Instead, trade became a weapon. Financial access became leverage. Raw materials became strategic assets. Economic interdependence stopped looking like mutual security and started looking like mutual vulnerability. And once governments began treating economic relationships primarily through the lens of national security, commercial decisions became military decisions in disguise. There is a modern relevance here, but it needs to be handled carefully. The world of 2026 is not the world of 1941. Modern financial systems are different. International institutions are different. Nuclear weapons radically change the consequences of great power war. Global supply chains are more complex, and today's sanctions regimes operate under legal and institutional frameworks that did not exist in the same form before World War II. History does not repeat mechanically. The useful parallel lies somewhere else. It lies in incentives. When countries become heavily dependent on foreign technology, energy, finance, shipping routes, or critical minerals, economic interdependence creates both efficiency and vulnerability. When one country uses that vulnerability as leverage, the targeted country may change its behavior, or it may seek alternative suppliers, or build domestic capacity, or create a competing economic bloc, or conclude that military force is becoming more attractive than continued dependence. Usually, sanctions do not lead to war. Most economic disputes never become military conflicts. That is precisely why Pearl Harbor is worth studying. It is an example of a situation in which economic pressure became entangled with territorial expansion, ideology, military planning, alliance politics, and shrinking diplomatic options. The warning is not that sanctions inevitably cause war. The warning is that coercion changes the incentives of the country being coerced. If policymakers focus only on the pressure they are applying and not on the decisions that pressure makes more attractive for the other side, they can miscalculate the entire strategic equation. And that brings us back to the image with which this story began: Pearl Harbor. For decades, the attack has functioned in popular memory as a beginning. December 7th, 1941, the day America entered World War II. That is true, but it is not the whole truth. The war in Europe had already begun. The war in China had already been raging for years. Japanese expansion had already challenged the international order. The United States had already begun using economic power to oppose that expansion. Japan had already begun preparing for the possibility that economic pressure would eventually become intolerable. By December 1941, the Pacific was not a peaceful world suddenly shattered by one morning attack. It was the final stage of a crisis that had been accumulating for a decade. The bombs over Pearl Harbor were the visible explosion. The deeper story was the system underneath them. A country dependent on foreign resources tried to build an empire that would eliminate that dependence. The countries controlling those resources tried to use economic power to restrain the empire. The pressure strengthened the incentive to seize resources. The threat of seizure strengthened the incentive to impose more pressure. Diplomacy struggled to break the cycle, and eventually, decisions that had once been economic became military. That is perhaps the most important lesson of Pearl Harbor. Wars do not always begin when the first soldier fires. Sometimes they begin when governments start reorganizing trade, finance, resources, and alliances around the expectation that conflict is coming. By the time the shooting starts, the decisive choices may already have been made. And the most dangerous moment may not be when two countries decide they want war. It may be when both decide that the other side has left them no acceptable alternative. If you had to identify the most important factor in the road to Pearl Harbor, Japanese expansion, American economic pressure, the struggle for resources, or diplomatic failure, which mattered most? Leave your answer below and subscribe for more documentaries examining the forces that shape markets, nations, empires, and the global order.